Martin Kingston is a veteran South African investment banker, known for his active role in shaping business policy. With a career spanning 40 years in finance, Kingston has held top positions in international and domestic banking and has become a prominent voice in South Africa's economic discourse. He joins us to explore all that's going on in our country and economy. In a country where corruption keeps stealing our future, compliance can't be a box tick. It must be a movement. Ethical compliance officers protect institutions, defend the truth, and rebuild trust in South Africa. We need leaders who do the right thing, especially when no one's watching. If you're ready to be part of the change, enroll in Khulisane Academy's 18-month compliance qualification. 2026 registrations now open. See if you qualify. Click the link. Martin Kingston, thank you so much for joining us on SMWX.
Well, thank you for having me, Sizwe. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a great honor to have you. We know you as someone who works at the interface of policy and economics, but tell us a bit more about your personal story. I was quite interested to hear about the story of your parents.
Yeah, well, my parents came from Central Europe. They were both refugees in the war. My mother before the war. She came out on the Kindertransport, and my father immediately after the war. He was in the Budapest ghetto. And they came to London. They didn't speak a word of English. They didn't have an education that had carried on. They interrupted their education. And they did what many people do when they're refugees. They sort of tried to deepen their roots into the UK. So my sisters and I had a completely conventional upbringing, albeit by parents who had no sort of antecedents in the UK. Went to school in the UK, and then when it was time to go to university, I wanted to pursue my passion. My passion was mythology. I wanted to find a university that could offer me comparative mythology, myths and legends. It didn't exist, but I went to university and studied English language and medieval literature, which was the next best thing. Wow. So Old Norse, Anglo-Saxon, medieval French, even Gothic, which doesn't exist as a country. It's what's called a postulated language, Gothic, Old High German. And the problem is that when you finish that, you can't do anything with it. It's other than teach it, and I wasn't bright enough or good enough to do either of those two things. So I became an accountant. I was told that if you become an accountant, a chartered accountant, you can always put bread on the table, assuming, of course, that you can grind your way through 3 years of articles. And it is grueling, for sure. Anyway, I joined what was then Pricewaterhouse, what is now PwC. And I spent 5 years at Pricewaterhouse qualifying as an accountant. And then I wrote my first only book. It was a bestseller, I have to say. It was VAT for Banks in Europe. I think we sold about sort of 100 copies, to be perfectly honest, mainly to clients that were banks. VAT had just been introduced. And then thereafter I joined the investment banking fraternity, or what was then called the merchant banking business. That was Morgan Grenfell. So that was really my professional career. And along the way, in 1981, I got married. I was pretty young when I got married, and had the first batch of children, and I've never stopped since then, either children or grandchildren.
Wonderful to hear that. Where does your association with South Africa start? And of course, you bravely associated yourself with the anti-apartheid struggle at a time when doing so was neither good for your career nor particularly fashionable.
Yeah. So the university I was at, Durham, was at the forefront of the anti-apartheid movement. And so in the 1970s, it was in full flow. So that was really my first real exposure to the struggle in South Africa. And I finished university in 1978, and I came to London, as I said. And as soon as I arrived in London, I met my first wife. As you say, it wasn't really very fashionable at the time. We fell in love. She had been brought to the UK when she was 3, when the ANC had been banned. And of course, then she was the daughter of an infamous rather than a famous individual. Her father was Oliver Tambo, her mother Adelaide Tambo. And as you say, it was not a career-enhancing move, but it exposed me to a sort of an extraordinary level of energy and I think sort of moral probity in terms of what was important in the world and in my life. And although I think that my employers found it rather strange, and certainly I wasn't invited to their homes many times, it was an extraordinary journey that I was able to embark upon as a consequence of that. In, I would say, a fairly conservative environment in London at the time. It's changed dramatically, I would argue, since then.
What is it important to understand about banking, investment banking, that most people don't know?
Well, the investment banking that I do, and of course investment banking is now a sort of a term that encompasses many different things, Sizwe, is the provision of financial advice, so strategic advice, the acquisition or the disposal of companies, large or small, the raising of capital, either in the public or the private markets, both debt and equity capital, advising governments, and over the past 40 plus years, I've advised many governments around the world, from those in Latin America, those in the former Soviet Union, to, of course, in Africa as well. And advising those governments either on raising capital, restructuring their finances, or indeed on some of the privatization processes or bringing the private sector in to play a more fundamental role. And I've done that both in Africa as well as in Asia, as I said, as well as in Latin America. And I think that that is very different from, if you like, the global markets activities of the research, sales and trading in equities, or indeed the provision of finance. When I was initially at Morgan Grenfell, it was in the pure provision of finance. It was acquired by Deutsche Bank. It was a very big move by Deutsche Bank at the time. And then we became a full-blooded, if you like, all-service singing and dancing investment bank that provided everything. So I had lots of exposure to, if you like, the full suite of those activities. And when I came to South Africa, effectively to run Deutsche Bank's business, then we were actually pursuing all of those activities. But my heart truly has been in the provision of strategic advice, whether it be to the public or the private sector, and indeed working at the interface between the public and the private sector to make sure that we can harness the skills and capabilities within business and within the business community, but also recognizing the role, remit, and ultimate responsibility of governments and their sovereignty.
Standard Bank's Group CEO, Sim Chabalala, recently spoke about African sovereign debt and said that he believes it's rated four rungs below where it needs to be. I wonder what you make of that suggestion, given that a lot of the thinking around B20 and G20 was trying to extricate the African continent from this debt burden and indeed the debt servicing cost burden under which many African economies are laboring.
Yeah, well, so you're absolutely right. There are two elements to that, in my view, Sizwe. The first is the quantum of the debt, and the second is the cost associated with it, the premium that people are paying on that debt. There are many, many countries, including those in Africa, that are, I would argue, over-indebted, that they have too much of a strain on their sovereign balance sheet. And the consequence of that is that their debt service obligations, be it repaying the debt or the principal or servicing the debt, paying interest or a coupon on that debt, erodes their ability to actually focus their time and attention and indeed their priorities on providing basic support and services to the population at large. Interestingly, the most indebted countries are not in Africa. The most indebted countries are in the West or indeed the United States. In fact, the argument, as you know, is that if you really want to make sure that the banks aren't going to go after you, make sure that you owe them so much money that they can't go after you. But there's no doubt that many countries, and South Africa is one such, has seen the level of its debt to GDP increase dramatically over many years, and it's a sort of a warning signal to many investors and institutions and rating agencies, and I'm sure we'll come on to rating agencies in a moment. The second is the premium associated with that debt, and of course, the lower one's credit rating, the higher the cost of debt. And there's been a lot of debate, most recently last week in the B20 and G20, as you've said, as to whether or not there isn't a perception premium that's attached to Africa that doesn't actually reflect the fundamentals, the economic and political fundamentals of the countries concerned, that the rating agencies, and very great significance is attached to the ratings that are provided by rating agencies, operate in a rather opaque manner. Nobody really knows what goes on behind closed doors. That's the thesis, even if they say that they're transparent about their approach. And therefore that African countries in particular, but not only, are penalized accordingly. So not only do they have to repay the principal, as I said, but also they have to service the debt with levels of interest that are unaffordable and in many cases inequitable. And of course, much work has been done. In fact, I think that there are now 5 or 6 studies that are contemporaneously in the market effectively. The most recent, of course, done by our own Trevor Manuel, so an excellent piece of work, which he presented to President Ramaphosa in his capacity as the president of G20 a few weeks ago, and which, of course, was one of the key building blocks of the declaration that was made over the weekend. And there's no doubt that many of us, I believe, would concur with the conclusions and the recommendations that there needs to be a fundamental reset of the way in which borrowing countries are viewed by those who lend to them, whether it be the markets, multilateral or bilateral agencies, private or public, as well as I said, the role of the rating agencies. But by the same token, that there needs to be a level of caution and prudence that is sort of introduced into the way in which those countries approach their borrowing, and having the right approach is absolutely fundamental. My concern, I have to say, is that although we saw, and maybe we'll talk about this, the declaration adopted unanimously, I suppose, in inverted commas, we do have to ask ourselves the question as to how implementable some of these recommendations are without the United States of America being part of that process. But I think it is fair to say that we need to have a much more pragmatic approach to ensuring that countries have the wherewithal to be able to provide what is required for their citizenry without it being eclipsed by their level of borrowing. And of course, the final point I'd make is that companies may become bankrupt, but countries effectively cannot be bankrupt.
And this ties into, as you say, ratings agencies on the one hand, these external bodies that kind of verify the credibility of a country's economy in the end. And we've scored a recent win with the FATF removal from the grey list. What do you think the importance of South Africa being removed from the grey list is, and how do we make sure we don't get put back on?
Yeah. So they're both key questions, because we had worked in support of the government, and I think we need to give credit where credit is due. Government led by National Treasury, and specifically by Ishmael Mamoniat Momo, played a phenomenal job in terms of identifying how we could effectively remove ourselves or be removed from the FATF grey list. As you said, if you look 2 years ago, of the 40 areas, 20 of them we were deficient. And we moved, I would argue, at breakneck speed to address each and every one of them progressively. And in doing so, the National Treasury, the Reserve Bank, other agencies of government worked hand in glove with the private sector to make sure that we could put our best foot forward. But putting our best foot forward was putting in place the reforms, the systems, the processes, the governance, the oversight that is required to give people the comfort that actually we should not be on the grey list, we should stay off the grey list, because we now have financial systems that withstand scrutiny, in particular, of course, with respect to anti-money laundering and the proceeds of crime and corruption. Now, I think we need to, by the same token, acknowledge that staying off the grey list is as important as being taken off the grey list. It was one of the key indicators for rating agencies, along with structural reform. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that there is more that we can, should, and must do to stay off the grey list. One of them, of course, is making sure that we don't just have the ability to identify, but to properly prosecute complex crimes, particularly financial crimes. Secondly, that we have a track record of receiving information, for example, from banks, and being able to process that information appropriately. I mean, at the end of the day, all of this goes through the banking system formally or informally. And the banks in South Africa have played, again, a significant role alongside other financial institutions in providing the support, the wherewithal, and I think, in fact, the sort of transparency that's required to give the comfort and the confidence to the Financial Action Task Force that we should be removed from the grey list. Now, the question that you ask about how do we stay off the grey list is equally important, which is that it's not just a sort of it's not just a single event; it's an ongoing level of commitment that is required, and I would say improvement in our reporting, in our ability to prosecute, in ensuring that we have the right systems and processes in place, and ultimately governance. And governance goes hand in glove with transparency and indeed with accountability. And I think that directionally, there's no doubt that we all understand, certainly those in the private sector and those who are tasked with this responsibility within government, as to the import of what you and I are talking about. Because at the end of the day, there's a cost attached. The cost attached is that if you're on the grey list, there are certain sources of capital that are not available, and those that are available attach a further premium to it. So, it's in our national interest to make sure not only that we stay off the grey list for grey list purposes, but for our own sort of, best economic outcomes.
Absolutely. And I wonder where you stand on this debate that's emerging right now as to whether South Africa's economy is turning the corner. On the one hand, there are those who say, well, look at the grey list, look at Eskom, green shoots and Transnet. We have, as Colin Coleman, who was recently on here, said, some are saying we've reached the bottom. Others say, well, these are wonderful signs, but really ultimately vanity metrics. Growth is still not where it needs to be, unemployment, inequality. And so we shouldn't celebrate prematurely. Where do you stand on whether we are truly turning a corner or whether we might actually be, or we might still have a further way to fall?
Yeah. So I think, that unfortunately these things are not binary. They're very complex.
Sure.
There is no doubt that there is further that we could go to fall. Life could become more challenging. Having said that, we've made dramatic progress over the past 3 or 4 years. And certainly the way that I look at it is that some of the key, if you like, constraints on economic growth. And at the end of the day, it's all about economic growth. It's all about sustainable, inclusive economic growth.
Yeah.
Now, when we're at 1.2%, that is woefully inadequate. We need to be at 3.5% growth just to stand still in terms of the levels of unemployment in this country. And we can all agree that those levels of unemployment, both within sort of the formal, informal, narrow and broad definitions, are wholly unacceptable and pose a real threat to the stability of the country. We can't have a situation which we do at the moment, where our second generation of youth since 1994 has come through the system, and 60+% of them cannot find work of any sort whatsoever, and certainly not of a permanent nature, that they don't have the skills, the capabilities to be able to contribute to the economic upliftment, not only of themselves, their families, their communities, but the country as a whole. So if we set as our minimum target 3.5 or 3%, and we're at 1.2%, I think we've got to identify that as a challenge. The second is that if we look at what happened in the journey that we've been through into the pandemic and out of the pandemic, the reality is that if we cast our mind back to 2020, when we went into lockdown, we had been just then downgraded to junk status. And there are many levels or layers of junk status. Obviously, we've drifted down through that subsequently, A, and B, that we were in a technical recession. And many people talked about what the recovery would be like for many countries coming out of the pandemic. In fact, compared to our peer group, we've taken longer to come out of the pandemic than any other country in the world. And only last year did we meet the GDP that we had in 2019, 2020 when we went into the pandemic. So those are sort of big warning signals for us. We know what the constraints are. The constraints are an absence of structural reform, or historically an absence of structural reform, making sure that the utilities that service the population at large, whether it be Eskom or Transnet, whether it be water, is available at both a competitive and reliable price and basis. We know that in terms of the education system and the hospital, or if you like, the sort of national health system, they are at breaking point at the moment. And yet we know that we have got enormous resources in the country, not just in the private sector, but certainly in the private sector, to be harnessed and to be made available to ensure that we can address and remedy those issues. There is, of course, one overall, if you like, pervading concern that I have over and above that, which is the levels of crime and corruption. I'm sure that we'll explore that as well.
Yeah.
And you can't just deal with one of these and hope that the others are going to take care of themselves. Now, if we deal with all of those in a sort of pragmatic but accelerated way, do I think we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and achieve our potential? Undoubtedly. And what we've seen, over the last 3 years, so the partnership in its current form between business and government, and Business for South Africa is the platform that we're using to interface with government at the level of the president, the cabinet, and of course, key ministries, as well as, of course, key agencies, whether those agencies be the NPA, whether those agencies be Transnet or Eskom, for example. What we've seen has been a remarkable turnaround. So if we think that in 2023, 2 years ago, we had nearly 290 days of load shedding. Much of it at levels 4, 5, and 6. This year we had 7. I think we've turned the corner. There's more to be done, of course, but there's no doubt that we've got the energy that's available. Now we can talk about whether the pricing is appropriate. If you look at the turnaround time for goods leaving our ports, it was 21 days 2 years ago, and it's 2 days today. If we look at the number of lorries that we're taking across our borders, it's dramatically improved over the past 2 years. If we look at the ability for the prosecuting authorities to identify and prosecute complex crime and their forensic capability, again, we've seen a sort of pickup, not as fast as it would need to be. When we look at Operation Vulindlela, the joint venture between the presidency and National Treasury, which is all about structural reform, there's been real breakthroughs, whether it be in terms of visa reform, whether it be in terms of identifying what the key constraints are in the system, for example, in terms of water. Now, there's many a slip twixt cup and lip, and indeed the time frame for addressing these issues is much more extended than any of us would like. And we've got to be patient, and patience is not something that we can really afford as a country right now. But I am of the view that the progress that we've made over the past 2 or 3 years demonstrates, and it's been acknowledged as such by all of the agencies. It's been acknowledged, if you like, by the strengthening of our currency. It was available and on show over the last week at B20, at G20, where I believe we showcased ourselves extraordinarily well, that we're on the right road. But we need to stay on that road, and we need to accelerate the rate of both decision-making, and these are difficult political decisions that need to be taken, and they need to be taken without fear or favor, and then they need to be implemented. And I think we all know, the president is the first to admit, that we have very significant challenges of capacity in the state. And there again, business has tried to make sure, on an arm's length basis, that we can provide the requisite skills, capabilities, and experience to shore up that capacity. When I say on an arm's length basis, I mean there are many people who accuse us of, if you like, overreach. We're actually not overreaching at all. We're making sure that the requisite capacity or wherewithal to achieve the implementation of those objectives are in place, but we need to stand back from overly influencing outcomes, and that's something that, again, that you may want to discuss. So when I sort of look at it in the round, my view is that, yes, I think that we are certainly making real progress. I think that there is light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a long tunnel. And there could be many interventions, including outcomes of a political nature, either domestically or exogenously, that could impact upon our ability to either maintain that trajectory or to turn down. We cannot afford as a country to turn down. I don't think there's anybody who would advocate that. But it's only going to be avoided by making sure that we harness all of the resources and skills that are at our disposal as a country across all social players in a coordinated way. And the challenge, I think, for many of us is that sort of trips off the tongue, but actually making that happen is much more challenging than it would appear at face value, ensuring that we've got the right players in the room, that we don't overcomplicate this, that we don't try and solve for everything, that we prioritize a few key interventions and use those as levers, if you like, to catalyze real progress. That is where we need to focus our attention.
Just to drill down on one of those worrying aspects, because I fully concur with you on the green shoots and the need to expand and grow where progress is being made. But of course, we've had this Mkhwanazi saga unfolding, as a key police general has suggested that organized crime is playing an uncomfortably large role in influencing criminal justice system, even politics at the highest level. This is profoundly concerning.
Yeah, it is concerning. And unfortunately, we had already identified crime and corruption as a key area of focus in our partnership with government. And in that approach, we had brought in very significant resources in each of the areas we've been looking at: energy, transport and logistics, crime and corruption, unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. We've brought in chief executives to oversee the work, who've got a day job running large companies, but in each and every one of these cases, we felt we needed to demonstrate our level of commitment, not only to government, but to society at large and back into the business community. In the case of crime and corruption, which is what you're talking about, we have three such chief executives: Mary Vilakazi of First Rand, Neil Froneman, who was the former chief executive of Sibanye Stillwater, and Gianni Durant of Remgro, and they've given an extraordinary amount of their time and commitment to this. And as I said, that was long before we even knew that General Mkhwanazi, many of us existed, or indeed was going to reveal what he has in the allegations that have been made. And I think we were aware of the fact that in the light of state capture, we hadn't really made the progress we needed to. That many of the Zondo Commission recommendations, in fact, I would say the vast majority remain, unimplemented, and even even Chief Justice Zondo, as he was, has publicly stated his exasperation at the fact that we haven't moved as quickly in prosecuting as we need. We know that the NPA is threadbare in terms of its capacity, not in terms of its capability necessarily. Some people might say that as well, but I think that it's got some highly capable people, but it doesn't have the quantum of resources, the depth of a bench strength that is required to take forward some of the challenges that we have. And we know that these wheels, and you know better than most, grind very slowly anyway, so people are frustrated. And we don't tell our own story as well as we could about the progress and the wins that we've made.
Sure.
I say all of this because when General Mkhwanazi made his allegations and the president established the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry, there were many people who were, I think, skeptical that yet another commission of inquiry would be helpful in the process. But we all felt intuitively, if we didn't know empirically, that there were problems that needed to be, put in the public domain.
Yeah.
Of course, what we have now is, if you like, we have two commissions going in parallel, because we've got the Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry, in many respects into the self-same issue. And it's not just, in my opinion, about the role of organized crime. It's about, dysfunctionality as well as crime and corruption in the criminal justice sector, as you say, going all the way up to senior politicians who've been identified, whether they're appropriately identified or not, is a separate issue.
Sure.
And my concern, I have to say, Sizwe, is that I think that it has fundamentally cast a cloud over any residual confidence that people had in the criminal justice system as it is today, the ability to identify, successfully prosecute, crime of any nature, whether we've got the political will or indeed the capacity. And I do hope that the Madlanga Commission will make its recommendations within the time frame concerned. But it is very difficult to see how it will be able to do so. It's as complex and as multifaceted as it is. And there are people who believe that there should be a root and branch reform of not only the police service, but the entirety of the criminal justice system. Only today, statements about judges, and indeed the Chief Justice, herself, expressing concern about some of the findings within the judicial system that should give us all cause for concern. I think that it's very good that it's out in the open. I think that it's good that we are sort of lancing the boil, but we need to be ready to come to the party. I don't know that we have all of the requisite resources within the country to do that, to be honest. I think that it would behove us to reach out to, friendly and well-resourced, capacitated, and if you like, independent countries outside to work alongside us, as we did between 1990 and 1994, when we established the systems and processes in the light of this constitution as it emerged, to make sure that we had a properly capable state. And I would argue that in that period of time from 1994 onwards, we did have a capable state, but it had been reinforced by lots of bilateral and multilateral assistance from abroad. And I think that those offers of assistance were accepted, with open arms and not with suspicion. And obviously the world has changed in the past 30 years, and we're living in very different circumstances. But I don't think that we should rule out the possibility of securing that support, because if we don't have as a bedrock of society a criminal justice system, including a police service that people and society at large, including the most impoverished, can rely upon, then we have nothing, to be honest.
Sure. And this forms part of a broader political picture in which South Africa has entered a new era, this governing coalition of many different parties coming together under the banner of national unity. We're speaking at a time where we're coming to the end of the first full year of this governing arrangement. There have been some bumps in the road, but in some ways it seems also as though things are starting to settle. How do you feel this GNU has performed so far?
Yeah. So if I can just go back sort of a few years, Sizwe. Of course, when we formed the partnership with government, it was in the face of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So an extraordinary corralling of resources across society, including business. But not just business, civil society, obviously, organized labor.
Which we forget in some ways,
we do forget.
Because that was, quite an operation in COVID.
No, it was extraordinary. We within 10 days mobilized the resources for Business for South Africa. We had 450 people working pro bono on the platform, focusing on 3 areas. One, of course, was bringing PPE into the country. We would forget we didn't have any PPE in the country. We had to bring it in. Business did that alongside the Solidarity Fund, which we formed alongside government, completely independently. And the Solidarity Fund, I think, was an extraordinary example of an organization that mobilized over 4 billion rand very quickly, was able to account for every rand and cent with an appropriately constituted board and management and structure, and lots of transparency that went alongside it. And we do forget it, and we forget the number of lives and livelihoods that collectively we saved along the way. We did the same thing in terms of mobilizing for the vaccination rollout program in November of 2020 and then into 2021, where the private sector administered some 45% of the vaccinations in the country. Our memories are short, but that laid the platform, if you like, for the economic partnership. The president approached us actually in 2020 and said, I think that we could put together an economic recovery strategy post-COVID, and we did. We assembled a team of 250 subject matter experts, and we produced a sort of post-COVID accelerated economic recovery strategy. It's available to read. There's a 1,000-page version, and then there's the 10-page version.
Okay. And where can people read that, by the way?
It's on the website.
On the website
it's
for
B4SA.
B4SA.
It is on the B4SA website. And it identified what were the low-hanging fruits. And the low-hanging fruits, of course, were in many respects the structural reforms that we're now implementing. But it's taken longer than it should have done, as we were discussing before. So my sense is that the ability to make sure that we could harness all of that skill and capability and work in concert with government was necessary. Now, I mention this because this predated the GNU.
Yeah, sure.
This was an ANC-controlled government. Obviously, many of us were very familiar with the ANC. We'd worked with them since 1994, or in some cases, in my cases, for long before that. But we were equally aware of the fact that they weren't the only game in town and not the only people with a monopoly of wisdom or talent to bring to the party. And in many respects, I welcome the GNU because I think that we've actually crowded in much greater levels of skills and capabilities and different perspectives. And we know that the president is open-minded about receiving different perspectives. I think that the other members of the GNU, and we have worked with many of them individually and independently beforehand, are more market-orientated, if you like, than some in the ANC might be. I actually don't care. We deal with the government of the day, provided that it's a government that respects the rule of law, that accepts the sanctity of the Constitution, and that acknowledges that there's an appropriate role for the private sector to play. If those three characteristics weren't met, I think we would find it very difficult to work with the government of the day. Now, when we meet with the president, which we do on a regular basis in the context of the partnership, and his ministerial colleagues, they're drawn from the GNU. And we find them all to be equally committed, if I can put it that way, to achieving, if you like, the social and economic advancement of the country. I know that it's seen many twists and turns. My own personal view is that it's in everybody's self-interest for it to continue for as long as possible. I certainly think it's in the national interest. We would be doing the country a huge disservice if we were not to harness, people with appropriate outlooks, skills, capabilities, to prosecute the agenda that we're talking about. So I am sort of cautiously optimistic that, as you say, we're through the first anniversary, that it will carry on. But I have no doubt equally that there will be challenges and headwinds along the way of a political nature. We know that's going to come, obviously, in the forthcoming year in the context of the local government elections. The sort of knives will be out. There'll be a lot
noise in the system. We've got to see through that noise in the system. We'll have the election, obviously, the leadership of the ANC thereafter, before we come to the national elections. And we have no time to waste. I mean, we need, as we were discussing before, to make sure that we can accelerate the progress rather than stall it, to ensure that we can achieve those levels of growth that are required if we're going to address the challenges of poverty and inequality, and most specifically, unemployment.
You've mentioned spending a lot of time working with the president. What's he like behind the scenes?
Oh, I think he's the same as he is actually in front of us. I mean, but my own experience of the president is that he is very thoughtful. He is very charismatic, as we can see. If I just talk about, the most recent experience of us seeing the president in G20, we must give credit where credit is due. I mean, he didn't pull a rabbit out of the hat. I mean, that's something a lot bigger and a lot better than a rabbit that he pulled out of the hat. To make sure that actually we got a unanimous declaration, obviously unanimous, those people who were there. Now, there are many who would say, well, it was motherhood and apple pie, but actually there are some fundamentals of truths in the declaration that most of us would support. I think that plays to his strengths. He likes to make sure that he can bring in differing views and find consensus. Now, of course, there are challenges within that because you gridlock if you bring
too many people in. He's been accused of being sort of not as decisive as he needs to be. We've seen in Vulindlela that actually those decisions are being taken. I mean, the track record in Vulindlela, which is economic reform and making those necessary structural changes to the economy, are being taken. And the reason why we have the president ultimately as our counterparty in terms of chairing the partnership is because we know that ultimately all decisions are taken by him or delegated by him to those who work around him in cabinet and elsewhere. I find him to be humorous, incisive, and extremely adaptable. I mean, if you look at the experience over the past week, there were many people, myself included, who were skeptical that we'd pull it off. If you'd have asked me 9 months ago, I think that the jury was out.
Yeah.
Even 9 weeks ago, we were concerned. But, with all of these things, there's a sort of a momentum that is built up. I think that we presented ourselves both in B20, and he not only graciously, but very importantly, was there for the closing of B20. And we made real progress in 8 fundamental areas of economic activity as business, and we will carry that on both in South Africa and with our partners around the world. Of that, I'm confident. The handover to the American Chamber of Commerce gave me every reason to believe that they will move forward with the same momentum and impetus and involve us, as was the case with the Brazilians to us. The way in which the president positioned the role of business, including, by the way, the role of the partnership with business, either the structured partnership with B4SA or many other manifestations of government working at provincial and local as well as at national level with business, demonstrates that he is an absolute believer in harnessing, the skills, capabilities, resources of society at large, including the private sector. I think that he has a very challenging job. Many people complain that he only has time for a small segment as opposed to for everybody. But I mean, I think that's the nature of being a head of state. And I certainly hope that he will carry on serving us as president of South Africa until his term has been concluded, because the work is yet to be finished. But we shouldn't place all of our reliance upon an individual. We know that. And we need to ensure that there's the requisite authority and, if you like, politicians around him, not just from the ANC but elsewhere, who can carry that work forward into the future.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the B20 handover. This is, of course, linked to one of the biggest foreign policy headaches that we have at the moment, which is our relationship with Washington. On the one hand, you've got this exasperating false narrative about Afrikaner persecution that we all know is, my word, not yours, nonsense. But on the other hand, we can't ignore our American partners in business or geopolitically. So how do you think we navigate this tense moment in relations with this all-important economic power?
Yeah, so that is what is, of course, preoccupying many of us, because I don't believe, and I think that's probably a consensus view, that we can spurn or ignore the need to work with the United States of America across a number of fronts, including but not only the economy. Sure. And obviously, sort of the tariffs of 30% damages our economy. We have 600 plus American companies that are invested in South Africa, some of the very biggest ones. I mean, we're advising Coca-Cola at the moment. It's got a huge commitment to South Africa and through South Africa to the continent. But there are many others who are continuing to invest over and above their existing activities in the country. We had nearly 600 American companies at G20 alone as a sort of a demonstration of support for what we're doing. But we can't do it without the blessing of the administration. I think what we all find difficult to accept sometimes, but we need to acknowledge, is that the private sector doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates in an environment and in an ecosystem that is overseen by politicians and by the government of the day. The government of the day at the moment is Trump 2.0 in America, and we need to acknowledge, as you say, that despite the fact that there's a false narrative, I don't know whether or not the White House believes that narrative or not. They may articulate it. But as we say, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. And it's a story that perhaps plays out well with a domestic base in America, but it causes immense damage, both on the international stage as well as here in South Africa. It contaminates a broader narrative about the progress that we're making as a country, because I think that we are making progress. We could perhaps do better about how we articulate that message domestically and internationally through a number of media. We should think about how we do that to best advantage. But again, we need to be honest about some of the challenges that we face. The narrative that comes out of Washington is not an honest narrative about South Africa. But we need to engage, I would suggest, not in the open environment, but behind closed doors, and in a very sort of assiduous, thoughtful, and careful way. Now, one of the challenges that we have is at the moment we don't have an ambassador in Washington.
Or
by
Beijing.
the way, we don't have an ambassador in Beijing. We don't have an ambassador in Tokyo. We don't have an ambassador in Paris. So we need to recognize, and it's not just an individual. We need to have the right skills and capabilities. Once again, within appropriate tram lines, I think that the private sector and business would be happy to make sure that they have resources at the disposal of the right people in Washington or New York or London or Paris or Tokyo or Beijing, for example. But we need to start with the ambassador, and that's obviously an urgent appointment and one that I hope the president is applying his mind to. These narratives run away with themselves. That's the problem, and the truth of the matter is that on the one hand, at G20, we demonstrated that the world moves on without America. On the other hand, in truth, it cannot, and it does not. We know how preoccupied people were, even this last weekend, with what was going on between Russia and Ukraine, and the American sort of attempt to sort of intervene there. And when I say attempt in a sort of constructive, not a destructive way, we need to stop the war. We see that they have played a role, which is an important role, in the context of what has been happening in the Middle East. And obviously, the ceasefire is absolutely crucial. And there again, there was sort of an issue and a narrative about South Africa's role in the context of Israel and the Palestinians, which has been, if you like, magnified and exaggerated by some people in the United States to our detriment. Now, we try as a country to walk a sort of a tightrope as a non-aligned country, or perhaps you say aligned with everybody as opposed to non-aligned. That is not the view, of course, in Washington. The view in Washington is that the friends that we make demonstrate that we're aligned with interests that are contrary to their interests. But I think that we need to be pragmatic at the same time in many ways, as the Indians have demonstrated that they can be pragmatic. And we need to put the rights of effort into resetting the relationship with the United States without conceding our sovereignty. And of course, that's the big issue here, which is, why should we abandon black economic empowerment because the Americans tell us to? Does that mean that we shouldn't adjust black economic empowerment because it's not necessarily fit for purpose? I think most people would say, yes, we should. It formed it served a particular purpose at a moment in time. Maybe it was well designed or constructed, but we need to have a sort of a reset and a review. Even the deputy president in the last week has said as much. Do we think that we could tighten up the language around expropriation without compensation to give people the reassurance that they require? By the way, business is not particularly concerned, including American business.
Sure.
But do I think that we could clarify that? Yes, we should, but not at the expense of being seen to do so at the behest or under instruction from another country, whether it be the United States or anywhere else.
Yeah.
So that's obviously something that is preoccupying, I'm sure, the politicians on the one hand, but also business, because we all feel that there is tremendous potential in South Africa, which is being constrained by some of these headwinds. One of these headwinds, obviously, is an adversarial relationship, if I can characterize it as such, between the current administration in Washington and ourselves. It will be interesting to see what happens post the handover of the presidency of G20. And as I said, I'm very confident that the work that business has done in the context of B20 is going to carry on at pace with the American Chamber, supported by the other 19 members of B20. And much of that can be done, not all of it, much of that can be done and should be done in any event, regardless of whether or not there's a B20 or a G20 or the need to work with governments. It is self-evident that there are key areas where business can collaborate, put their shoulders collectively to the wheel and see a better outcome. And that's exactly what the 8 working groups or work streams of B20 have sought to achieve. But you're right in saying that there is a real issue, and the elephant in the room, or one of our elephants in the room, which we need to deal with, is an appropriate resetting of the relationship between the United States of America and South Africa.
Absolutely. Well, can we send you to Washington after hearing that?
That's not going to happen. Yeah. No. Done. I hope that person's already been chosen.
Martin Kingston, it's been such a joy to speak to you. Thank you for sharing your views.
Thank you, Sizwe. Lovely to be here.
Like, share, subscribe. Help us reach that next milestone of 400,000 subscribers. Comment down below and see you on the next one. Aye.